There we go. So it looks like there's no viewers yet. There we go. All right, so we're about ready to get started. Oh, that's me. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. I'm sure there'll be more popping in as we go through this interview. But welcome to today's edition of SFL Live. As you know, this is a little bit of a different show because we're focusing on Liberty 101, which is an online course that SFL's put together in conjunction with Learn Liberty to go through all of the basic tenets of the philosophy of liberty and to give you some background in what it is that libertarians actually believe. So you saw me at the last interview we did on this subject. I'm Akex McHugh, a communications associate at Students for Liberty. And I'm joined today by Professor Chris Koopman, who is both a professor who teaches at GMU's law school, that's George Mason University, as well as a fellow at the Mercatus Centre, and as of a couple days ago, one of Forbes 30 under 30 to watch in law and policy. So Professor Koopman, I don't know if you want to say a few words about yourself, just introduce yourself to everyone.
Sure, I think you handled it pretty effectively. I don't know if I have anything else to add. So I do research at the Mercatus Centre at George Mason University. I cover a whole host of topics, mostly from a law and economics perspective, in particular looking at the intersection of regulation, competition, and innovation. And then I also teach in the law school, and then I teach undergrads in economics of regulation. So it gives me a nice opportunity to talk about a whole lot of fun issues. I think we'll probably cover some of those today, some of the things I talk about in the videos. But it also gives me an opportunity to do really cool stuff like this. So I'm really excited to be here, and I'm glad for the invitation.
Excellent. Yeah. So I get the feeling, based on a lot of the work that I've seen from you and a lot of the things you talk about in the videos, you're very excited about the sharing economy. You're very excited about a lot of the new things that are happening in the economy. But I was wondering, which of the videos was the most exciting for you to film? Which of these issues really gets you fired up?
Yeah, so first of all the videos were fun to make. So if you guys haven't watched them yet, I would encourage you to go find them. I think they're on ISFL's website as part of the Liberty 101 program. They were a lot of fun to make. It was a fun day shooting them all. And I'm really happy they turned out so well. But I would have to say probably the spontaneous order video was my favorite, especially given the fact that it's not a topic I get to talk about a lot in a lot of detail. It's not something that people, reporters or people on the Hill are typically asking me to explain to them. So it was a nice opportunity to talk about an issue that I think is central to the idea of liberty and law, and something that I don't often get to talk about like that. So it was really fun and exciting to put the script together and then to be able to do the video on spontaneous order.
Great. Yeah, I mean, it's always nice to get into issues that, the mainstream of politics or the media doesn't talk about, but are central to the ideas of good governance and to a healthy, wealthy society. I guess I should add, before we get much deeper into this, you can find the videos both on SFL's website, and if you're watching this from the link that we sent out in an email earlier today, you actually should have a sign-up form just to the side of this embedded video, so you can do that right on the same page. And if you sign up for the course through SFL's form, either during this interview or up to an hour afterwards, we're actually going to give you a discount code for the ISFLC coming up in February. So if you want to get $15 off of your ISFLC registration, make sure to sign up for the course soon. And even if you don't do it today and you later decide to, you should sign up anyway. But you can also find the videos on the Learn Liberty website if you already are involved with them and want to go through that way, just whatever's easiest for you. All right, so with that out of the way, my next question for you, Chris, is about something that comes up in a couple of the sections, actually, this idea of the common law, right? So you mentioned that most of the things we have laws against are things that people agree are bad anyway, right? So like you say, most people wouldn't go around murdering each other if there wasn't a law against murder, because most people think that that's bad anyway. They'd be shamed by their neighbors, all of these things. I was wondering, do you think that the consensus around what's bad and what's good continues to grow as time goes on? So I guess in other words, as time goes by, do you think we'll need less and less coercive enforcement against bad behavior?
Yes, I do think that is true, that I think as we continue to exchange and produce and people become more civil, there is less need for, let's say, coercive government intervention to mandate certain behaviors. But with that said, I think it's important to look at the common law and exactly what it is that the common law did, let's say 200 some odd years ago, when common law offenses were really popular. You know, that most courts today aren't enforcing common law offenses; they're enforcing just civil, criminal offenses that, you know, some legislature has put on the books. But the common law developed spontaneously. It was over time as issues arose, and they tweaked on the margins, and they got rules right, and bad rules were thrown away. And if you look back, things like murder, manslaughter, kidnapping, rape, battery, assault, all these things were common law offenses. They were things that we as a society had agreed, and people individually had agreed that these are bad things, right? It doesn't matter your moral code. It's pretty consistent that people believe that these things are bad. And so the common law offenses were created to sort of handle the marginal cases, you know, those people who are deviating from sort of the accepted behavior and the accepted norms. But what you see today, and I think when you look at sort of walking back this sort of coercive government intervention in the form of criminal law, and, you know, the growth of criminal law that we've seen in the past 150 years or even in the last 50 years, is that, you know, what was found as a common law offense were mostly crimes that involved a victim. They were crimes against another's person or property. But what you see today is a lot of the growth in criminalization has to do with victimless crimes. So the idea that, you know, okay, we don't all agree that these things are bad, but some of us think that this is bad for you, and you should therefore not be allowed to do it. Oh, and by the way, we made it a crime for you to do it, even if you wanted to. And I think going forward, back to your original question, I think as people realize that all this is doing is creating pretext for further government intrusions into individual liberty, that there will be a growing reluctance to continue to enforce these types of laws going forward. And I think that you're seeing some of this already. So as state legislatures continue to walk back, let's say, criminal laws that some people say, wait, is it even a crime? Let's say, you know, what's going on across the country with this push to get away from overcriminalization. I think a lot of that is people are saying we have come to some consensus as to what is okay and what is not okay. And a lot of the coercive sort of criminal laws that we're seeing are things that have ventured out of the realm of things that we have all agreed that are not okay to do, into things that there's a little more gray area as to whether or not people should be allowed to do them.
Okay, so yeah, that's actually a really great answer. I guess you're saying less than the things that we agree on expanding, we'll just agree to disagree on more things as we realize how hard it is to force other people to take care of themselves or do things that we'd like them to do or annoy us less.
Yeah, and I think, you know, would we see more murder if murder was a crime? It was not a crime. I doubt that we would see some, you know, spike in murders. You know, maybe we would. There would be some marginal cases of people who would now maybe go murder because it's no longer a crime. But as a society, we would take care of that. You know, we would take care of that as a society. The other things, let's say the victimless crimes, the things like drug use and other personal exchanges between consenting adults, those things are more of a gray area. Those are the ones that the common law, for the most part, never developed offenses or never developed rules against because it wasn't clear that there was an actual violation to someone's person or property happening there. And I think that's what you see in this sort of over-criminalization of the last 50 to 100 to 150 years. And you're starting to see some of that walk back as people realize that it really has, like I said before, just given pretext for further intrusions. As they say, well, we've made this thing illegal, therefore we should also make this other thing illegal, and so on and so forth, as you see people build on and sort of these just cascades of government intervention into private behavior.
So it's almost like the more, the easier we make it to enforce petty things against other people, the easier it is for everyone to argue that their petty thing should be enforced.
Exactly. That I think once people say, oh, well, if we're going to make this thing illegal, well, there's this, it's just only slightly different, but it's more or less the same. Well, let's include that and that and that and that. And that's where you really see, you know, in recent years, this growth in basically anything anyone doesn't like, they try to make a crime, they make it a crime to do, you know, whether it be daily fantasy sports or drug use or anything in between. Is that if someone says, I have a personal opinion on this thing, and then they tend to look to the government and say, make my opinion universal.
This actually leads really well into the next subject that I wanted to touch on, talking about things that people do to themselves that we may not want them to do to themselves, but you know, if we really wanted to stop them, we'd have to coercively stop them from doing it. Things like the war on drugs are a great example of this kind of law. But so in the videos, you talk about something called special knowledge. And you say that we should let people do what they think is best for themselves, even when we think we know better, because only they have special knowledge about their own lives. And so I wanted to ask you, what exactly do you mean by special knowledge, and why is it so crucial to good decision making?
Yeah, and I think that's a crucial part of understanding spontaneous order, is that none of us has complete knowledge. No one person can know everything, but all of us know something. In particular, we all know something about ourselves, our unique circumstances, conditions, our capabilities, our preferences. And this is really what I mean by special knowledge, the idea that we all know something, that all of this knowledge is diffuse among society, and that no one person could ever possibly acquire all of it to make adequate decisions for everyone. So allowing people to operate based on their own special knowledge allows people to do what's best for them. It allows them to be entrepreneurial as they see opportunities that, let's say, a central planner might not see, or a group of people who are making laws might not see. And it allows people to exchange and produce in ways, in particular in ways that we would have never imagined, but for giving people the opportunity to take what they know and take what they have and put it to productive use. And I think that's a key component of spontaneous order, is that it's the result of human action, but not of human design. That allowing people to take what they know about themselves and act on that, and all of us acting on our own special knowledge allows us to coordinate with one another in a way that simply making a rule or a set of rules would never allow us to achieve those same goals.
So you're telling me that, you know, every single person from the high school dropout to the billionaire to, you know, Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders both have special knowledge that's different than anybody else has and is crucial to their ability to manage their own lives?
Oh yeah, certainly. I would say, you know, I have a 5-month-old son, and I would say he has special knowledge about his own preferences, right? In his own unique situation. Granted, he can't communicate that in the same way that, let's say, Donald Trump or Bernie Sanders can. You know, he just cries and spits out his food until I figure out which baby food he actually likes. You know, he doesn't like sweet potatoes. He doesn't like carrots, but he does like bananas. And, you know, it's just a matter of me figuring that out. Now, if I were to make a rule, you know, ex ante, and just say we will only eat sweet potatoes because I like sweet potatoes, well, that takes away his free choice. Even though he's 5 months old and doesn't have much choice, he still does have choice, and he makes it clear what he does and doesn't like. And if we were to create rules like that for society, that is, say, everyone must do this one job, or everyone must live this particular way, it takes out the ability for all of us to use the special knowledge, so everyone, and right, it doesn't matter your political perspective, your age, your race, your gender, your creed. We all have preferences, and we all have unique understanding of our own situations and our own circumstances, and allowing people to act on those allows order to come about in a way that simply trying to create order would never accomplish. Trying to give everyone the same preferences and give everyone the same temperament would just end in utter failure. So allowing people to individually act on what they know about themselves and their immediate surroundings allows all of us to come to better outcomes than if we were to just try to set from the beginning what it is that we want to achieve.
And so, correct me if I'm wrong, but that issue that you're describing right now, is that what Hayek called the knowledge problem? That nobody can gather all of the knowledge in society because of how dispersed it is between each and every individual?
Exactly. So if you were to go and to read Hayek's The Use of Knowledge in Society, he would say there are orders that are arising. And, if you read his work on cosmos and taxes, there are orders that are arising that people look and say, wow, that's so simple yet complex and efficient. It must have come about by some design, and it didn't. All of us acting on our own individual preferences and our own individual knowledge allows us to exchange, produce, and seek our own ends in ways that allows this order to arise far greater than trying to plan it ever could. And in fact, it just couldn't. And that's the knowledge problem. It couldn't be planned. The idea that a central planner could have all the information necessary to make all of the decisions required to make society function the way that it does now is just a complete and utter failure. The idea that we could plan it all out from the beginning is just untrue.
Great, thanks. So that's your first reading assignment, everyone. Use of Knowledge in Society. We'll see how many recommendations we can rack up throughout the interview. But the next question that I wanted to ask you was to jump back a little bit from the abstract level and talk about some of the things that have been going on in the US in the past, well, I would say decades, but you mentioned earlier, the past 100 years, the expansion of legislation and of government. I was wondering, what do you think is to blame for the massive growth of the number of laws on the books? I mean, in the US specifically, but if you want to talk about other countries as well, if you have knowledge there, feel free to touch on those as well.
Yeah, so my perspective is almost solely focused on U.S. domestic policy. So I couldn't talk in too much detail about what's happening in other countries, but the trend is pretty much universal toward creating law without removing others. Although there was maybe Alberta, there is a part of Canada that just passed a rule that says for every law or regulation that's created, they have to remove one. Which is interesting, the idea that, sort of legislative spring cleaning, go through and find the old laws that no longer make sense or are outdated or become outmoded as technology and the market has continued to evolve over time. Find those and get them out of the way. But to your question as to who's to blame, I'm not sure if there's any one person or any group of people that I could point to and say, this is who we should blame for this problem. If it were that easy, the problem would probably have been solved by now. But the fact remains that, it's probably, actually not probably, it is the result of a confluence of issues and various preferences of individuals who are all involved in the lawmaking process, and also interest groups. So, for example, you think insiders within an industry benefit the more complex the regulation is on that industry. So the more difficult it is for an entrepreneur to jump in and to grow within an industry, the more that benefits a particular insider, let's say an established incumbent. So to give you an example, think of, let's say, a young entrepreneur that wants to begin brewing beer. So I live in Virginia, I work in Virginia. So, let's say I come up with the perfect recipe for the most delicious, pumpkin spice latte beer you've ever had. In Virginia, it's as difficult for me to wade through the process and actually get into the market to comply with all of the state, federal, and local regulations. It's as difficult for me to do that as it would be for me to go start a legitimate business in China or Venezuela. And that's a huge benefit to established brewers. They get less competition because all of these artificial barriers to entry have been erected. So I think to a certain degree, insiders are partly to blame as they continue to lobby for more regulation and more protectionism on their particular industry or their segment of an industry. But then I also think politicians are part of the problem. Well, they write and they pass the laws. So that's one person you can point to and say they're as culpable for this as anyone else. But also they have a strong incentive to do it. Because there are insiders that are, pressuring them to make more laws. You also have, let's say, consumer protection groups that are saying, what law are you going to pass to keep us safe? And also you have, individual voters that many of them, and this is due to rational ignorance, the idea that people just don't derive enough benefit to be well informed enough to understand what their legislators are doing. The assumption among many voters is that if a legislator is doing something, it's better than them not doing anything at all. And when a legislator does something, they make law. That's all a congressman or a senator or a state legislator or a member of parliament or anyone else can do is make law. That's what they're there for. That's their one job, make law. So that's what they do. They just continually turn out laws, and administrative agencies are empowered to then continue to enforce these laws by creating more rules, because it gives us the impression, or many of us the impression, that they're solving problems, that this law is going to solve a problem, and it positions them as problem solvers. I saw a congressman recently speak at a college, and he was introduced as having more of his bills signed into law than any other member of whatever Congress it was that he was a part of, the 108th or 109th Congress or whatever it was. And I thought to myself, that's sort of a strange way to measure success as a congressman, is that I made more laws than anyone else. And people in the crowd they were like, oh wow, that's interesting. Oh, very nice. He had a lot of his bills were signed into law. He must be solving a lot of problems. And I think that's really a confluence of all of this is to blame. And in particular, I think it's the idea that as we're creating new laws, like I said before, we never removed the old laws. So even some states, for example, I think it's Kentucky, and you can go online, there's a website that does this, all these funny old laws. You can go and read them. So in some states, I think it's Kentucky, you can't walk around with a carrot in your pocket or something like this. And it has to do with horse thieves from the 1830s. And it's sort of like, they created that law, almost 200 years ago, and here we are with the law still in the books. Or there was another one that had to do with highway robbers. It was something like I can't recall exactly what it was, but it was something like a person cannot wave down traffic unless they have a car present with them, or something like this that would say, it's sort of a hitchhiking thing, but it was written long before hitchhiking. And these laws are still in the books, and they don't go away. And here we are adding to the problem without taking anything out of it. So I think some of that has to do with interest groups, politicians, voters, but then also the fact that we're constantly adding and never subtracting. So I guess that's my long-winded way of saying there are a lot of pieces to blame for this, and it's a complex problem, but it's not insurmountable.
Thanks. No, I think that required a long-winded answer. You're very right to point out all of these different streams. It's actually sort of funny when you're talking about this bias towards action, this need to do something. all the time. It reminds me of something that a manager told me when I was working at Starbucks as a barista, which was, it doesn't make any sense to make more drinks if they're all crap. If they're going to scald somebody or poison somebody or, not fit in the cup, it doesn't matter how quickly and how many you make. You're not solving the problem of, serving the customer if you're not actually making them correctly, if they're not any good. So that's really interesting, and it's cool to hear that Canada is doing something about removing some of these bad laws that end up doing more harm than good. And you sort of have answered my next question with your answer to that one, which was going to be about, why do we have to be careful about sacrificing liberty for the greater good or for, a solution to today's problem, someone actually doing something. And it sounds like there's a lot of reasons why we should be very wary of that, including the special interests that you talked about, including this bias towards action that clouds our judgment, unintended consequences that we're not going to see. So yeah, that's something I'm now very worried about. Thank you.
Yeah, and I also think, to your question, why should we be wary of sacrificing our liberties for the greater good? I think what's interesting, and especially you see this when people talk about it in the abstract, is that when you ask someone, are you willing to sacrifice personal liberties for the greater good? I think a man or woman on the street would probably say, hey, it depends. What's the good and what are the liberties I'm sacrificing? But if you were to follow that up with, are you willing to sacrifice, specifically your personal liberties today for the greater good versus someone else's personal liberties today for the greater good? I think then people really become leery of giving that up right away. So oftentimes it's a much different story when people have to say right here on the spot, am I willing, not in the abstract, to give up this abstract idea of liberty for this abstract idea of, the greater good, but am I willing to restrict my freedom to choose how I live my life so that we can try to achieve some abstract idea of a greater good? I think people oftentimes will be much more skeptical of that. And I think that's because there's this innate fear of the danger of giving that up to someone else, be it, a group of people or the government. I think this is why it doesn't matter what it is, but oftentimes when people start infringing on what we believe to be our rights, we get very mad. Very, very mad. And I think when people think about it in this broad abstract way, and they say, oh, am I willing to sacrifice liberty for a better society? Well, I think people are willing to entertain that idea if they continue to think about it in the abstract. But if you were to say, are you willing to give up the freedom to choose your job, to choose your religion, to choose who you love and spend your life with, to choose how you raise your children, to choose where you go to school, all these things that people hold very dear to themselves, are you willing to give those things up? And I think people very often then begin to get leery of giving those things up. And there's a real danger in that, in giving that sort of stuff up. At that point, then the idea of the individual gives way to collective thinking. And you simply just become a cog in the machine, right? You are something that can be removed and replaced at any time because you don't matter, the group does. And that's what's dangerous. And no one should be treated that way. And I don't think anyone wants to be treated that way themselves. And when you start thinking of, liberty versus the greater good in a very real context, I think people have a more keen awareness of what they're actually giving up when they have that. Then all of a sudden people become much more leery of ever giving that up for, not even a guarantee, but I would say it's just a simple, abstract thought, the greater good, a more peaceful society, or what have you. I think people typically just use the idea of the greater good as a lodestar, right? They just pour whatever they think is good into that idea, and then they say, well, if you just let us make all the decisions. We will achieve those things for you. But that goes back to Hayek's knowledge problem, right? That when you start giving up liberties and personal freedom for the greater good, you're no longer in control of your decisions, but you know best your own situation, and you're in the best position to decide for yourself what you should and should not be doing. So to give it up isn't just on a moral sense, isn't just dangerous, but it's disastrous in that you're no longer able to leverage those opportunities that you see every day.
So I guess better than saying, would you give up liberties for the greater good, to look at it as, would you definitely give up liberty for a chance at what somebody thinks is the greater good?
Yeah, and more often than not, someone else's opinion of what the greater good is, because the greater good isn't, what Alex thinks or what Chris thinks. The greater good is what the group thinks, and now it becomes, okay, you don't like that, but the rest of us do, and you've already agreed to this arrangement. Therefore, you no longer have a say in what we do. And I think that's what's most dangerous, is there's no, in particular when you do this through the government. Now, if this were private arrangements or something, you can always opt out. But there's no opportunity for real exit oftentimes when these sort of collective arrangements are put together. In fact, they, think of North Korea, for example. You are explicitly not allowed to leave because that is sort of the end of collective thinking, is what you see there is people literally become nothing more than cogs in someone's machine.
Okay, yeah, so that's a really central issue, balancing liberties against calls for the greater good, against all of these other wonderful things the government promises us. And that's actually, it's interesting that it comes up. This is one of the things that SFL likes to push on really hard, because we recognize that a lot of people do understand when it's about their own personal liberties that it's a problem. They understand the "don't tread on me," but we give out stickers now that say "don't tread on anyone" to try and get them to understand, okay, you view yourself as an individual and you view everyone else as cogs in this machine, but you have to remember that everyone else is an individual just like you are. So that's a very important reminder for everybody.
Yeah, and I think oftentimes it's probably when people answer that question, yes, when they say, are you willing to sacrifice liberty for the greater good, or individual freedom for the greater good? Typically what people are saying is, yes, I am willing to sacrifice someone else's liberty and someone else's personal freedom or individual freedom for the greater good. But when it comes time for them to commit, now all of a sudden it becomes a much different story. But I think at that point, if as a society, if we're willing to sacrifice someone else's greater good or someone else's liberty for the greater good, oftentimes it's only a matter of time until it comes back to us. And that's why I think something like "don't tread on anyone" is an important first principle, because it isn't just about protecting yourself, it's about protecting others as well, because by protecting others, you're also protecting yourself oftentimes.
All right, so moving on to something a little bit different, I want to go back to the first video, which is on spontaneous order, that very central idea we've been talking about for a minute here. In that video, you talk about how ARPANET, the original version of the internet, turned into the internet as we know it today. You compare, how cruddy and hard to use ARPANET was to the wonder and amazingness of the modern internet. Could you talk a little bit about why the internet is so amazing and what happened to allow it to become what it is today?
Yeah, so I think it's really easy to see how amazing the internet is. I'm sure the best example of that right here is what we're doing. We're able to connect with one another, from two different states, really. You're in DC, I'm in Virginia, and people are going to be watching this all over the world. And I think that really highlights how amazing the internet has become. But I think it's not just that. I think it's all the other things that have come along in the past, even just 2 or 3 years. So you think of these amazing technologies, these amazing services that allow us to connect, exchange, and produce with one another in ways that just simply weren't available 5 years ago, and definitely weren't available 10 years ago, and were just a dream of futurists even 20, 25 years ago. So think of something like Uber. I do a lot of research on the sharing economy, and something like Uber. The idea that you can simply just push a button. I mean, I have the Apple Watch, and it's to the point now where I just push my watch. Literally, I push an Uber button, and a car comes and picks me up. That's the internet. I mean, that's the amazing outcome of allowing people to experiment. And I think why it's been so, to get to the second part of your question, why have we gotten to the point that we have? And I talk about this in that video, is that in the early 90s, the federal government decided, hands off. We're not going to regulate the internet. We're not going to continue to dictate what it can and can't be used for with an iron fist. We're going to allow people to experiment, allow people to do whatever they want with it, for the most part. And that's what you saw. And you see it, just all sorts of things come out of it. YouTube, Netflix, Amazon, eBay. All these things are born out of the experimentation, and in particular the innovation that was allowed to thrive once the government decided it was no longer going to dictate in minute detail how the ARPANET or the internet would be used. And once they stepped off, then you just see this just beautiful cornucopia of amazing things just happen. No one planned it, and no one was dictating exactly how it would come about, and it didn't always go well, right? Companies came, companies went. We had an internet bubble burst in the late 90s. It's not pretty, but it's gotten us so much further. I mean, this has created destruction in action. We've seen, even in the past few years, something like taxes. We've seen an industry that stood unshaken for 90 years in some instances around the country fall apart in a matter of months because the internet was allowed to disrupt local transportation services. And I think that's by taking a hands-off approach, in particular the federal government taking a hands-off approach, and then preempting state governments, in particular in the United States, from getting involved in regulating the internet. It allowed all of these entrepreneurs and innovators to do what they do, and that's find opportunities to create value for individuals. And that's where we are today, and it is amazing. And if the government had kept treating ARPANET the way it was, we wouldn't be talking like this right now, and my guess is the world would be a worse place for it.
Right, I might have had to actually come out to Virginia for this interview, or you come into DC.
I'll stay in Virginia. I'll stay in Virginia.
So yeah, it's really amazing, and it's very cool that we have that neat little natural experiment that happened when the government decided to change their policy in the 90s. As a follow-up to this whole discussion about the growth of the internet and how this all happened, it's great that the government decided to not regulate as much in the 90s. Today, we're starting to hear talk about regulating the internet again. We hear about regulating it to protect children from inappropriate content, to combat cyberbullying, to do things like ensure equal access to content. And so this one in particular is a big debate right now. We often hear it called net neutrality. And I was wondering, first of all, just if you could talk about that issue a little bit and explain it to people, because it's a complicated one, but also, so those all sound like decent goals, right? Protecting kids, stopping bullying. But my guess is that you see a lot of these proposed regulations as similar to the restrictions that made ARPANET so bad in the first place. So I was just wondering what your opinion was on some of those proposed regulations, and if you could talk a little bit about that issue.
Yeah, sure. So in a nutshell, net neutrality. So the net neutrality debate was over whether or not internet service providers, so the people you get internet from, whether or not they ought to treat all data the same. So that's, in a nutshell, what network neutrality is about. It's saying that they are not allowed, as a company, to give preference over certain data, or give preference to certain data over others. Right? So in particular, you hear this idea of like an internet fast lane. So the idea that an internet service provider may make it easier for one website to load and make it harder for another website. Now it's a debate that pitted content creators, let's say like the Netflixes of the world, against the people who are actually making the infrastructure available for people like us and companies like Netflix to interact with one another. The idea being that
so that would be like, sorry, that would be like the Comcast and Verizons of the world?
Yeah, so somebody like Comcast or Verizon saying, oh, we aren't, and it could be something as simple as this. It's Comcast or Verizon saying, all these people are seeking this website. It's slowing down our network. So if we were to slow down this particular piece of data, then it would allow everything else to flow smoother, or to have a fast lane where you can pay and have things, particularly from a content creator perspective, to have things go to people faster than, let's say, they otherwise would. Now that's something that's always taken place in the internet. Is they're constantly discriminating against certain pieces of data, and you think even, for example, for good reason. Let's say like if you ever get internet access in an airplane, they say you cannot stream while you get internet access in an airplane, because someone trying to stream a video in an airplane will take up all of the bandwidth, and no one will be able to do anything because it'll slow the entire process down. So they're constantly discriminating against certain certain content providers, because they're saying it's easier to curate the network if we let some come faster, some slower, what have you. But I think, again, this all goes back to the idea that someone can centrally plan how people transact on the internet, instead of allowing these companies to decide for themselves what's best for their customers, to tell them what's best for their customers. And I think that's really where this debate really revolved around, is, in essence, proponents of network neutrality saying, this is how we believe the internet ought to operate, and therefore we will make a law to ensure that that's how it works. But like so many other interventions and programs and laws, we shouldn't measure them by their intentions, but their outcomes. And only time will tell what effect this will have on the ability of the internet to remain awesome. But it certainly will make it more difficult for internet service providers to continue to provide the type of service that has made everyone so dependent and so happy with the internet. Very few people complain about the internet. People are, at least I've never encountered anyone that's like, man, the world is a worse place because of the internet. Again, most of the people I interact with are on the internet, so you're not going to run into those people there. But it really has made the world better. It's allowed us to connect and exchange and produce in more efficient and more effective ways. And stepping in ex post now and saying, gosh, we really think the world ought to look this other way, will most definitely cause problems. What those problems will be is yet to be seen, but I think that's just my short take on net neutrality.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. I know there's a lot to get into there, so it's not really possible to talk about all of the issues involved. But I thought it was interesting. You said it's a way of telling companies what they can and can't do for their customers. And I was just thinking, by extension, it's a way of legislating what customers can choose and saying, we know that this is the best internet for you, and we're not going to let you pick between Comcast and Verizon and all of these other approaches to it.
Right. Yeah, or even, let's say, for example, a company wants more people to use their website, And so if they were to go to a cell phone company and say, will you exempt the use of our website? We'll pay you for it, but will you exempt the use of our website from the data accounting? You know, if someone only has a gig of data and say, oh, well, if they're using it for this purpose on our website, we'll pay you, cell phone company, to not charge it against them. That may actually violate network neutrality or net neutrality rules, which makes it really hard, let's say, for companies to do what they do, and that is find new and innovative ways to get their product into the consumer's hands.
Great. So I'm going to skip a couple of questions because we're running out of time here, but there are a couple that I really, really wanted to hit and make sure that we talked about. The first has to do with arguing with non-libertarians about some of these issues, or I guess people who don't understand ideas like spontaneous order or limited government, things like that yet. And one of the things that comes up in the videos is this, and that we've talked about already, I guess, is this idea of special interests and how much ability they have to influence legislation, to influence governance. And one of the arguments that I often run into, and I'm sure a lot of people have experience running into as well, is people further to the left who will say, okay, yeah, these special interests working with the government to get what they want is bad, but they say, let's just get rid of all the special interests and leave the government exactly as it is. So I was wondering, how would you explain to someone like that why that approach doesn't work as well?
Yeah, so I think as long as people have been around, there have been special interest groups, right? People who have wanted special things for themselves and people like them. So I think that's important to remember, is that sort of this group mentality, this idea that, you know, all of us will work to get what we want, is sort of a part of human nature. So I think this isn't unique to me, this idea. It's actually something James Madison brings up in the Federalist Papers. And it essentially goes like this. If you want to get rid of special interests, and you want to do it by changing people, there are two ways to do it. You can remove their ability to speak, and remove their ability to assemble with one another, which I don't think to say people are not allowed to freely speak and assemble. That's one way to get rid of it, and I think that's no one. I think left, right, center. It does not matter your political persuasion. I don't think people would want that world. Or you could make everyone think the same, right? And that's impossible. Right? People will always have preferences. People are people, and they will seek to satisfy those preferences. So those are impossible. So in terms of getting rid of special interests by changing people or regulating people, I think that's impossible. So what you have to do is you have to look toward government and say, how do we limit the ability of government to satisfy the preferences of individuals who are seeking favors from the government? In particular, I think where you really see this is when big business comes along and begins to ask for something. And it doesn't matter the industry. It could be banking, it could be oil, it could be manufacturing, it could be exporting. When big business comes along, people are like, well, we got to get big business out of government, right? We got to get big business away from government. In the way that they come to enforce something like that is simply, like we were saying before, limiting their ability to speak and assemble, or trying to mandate that they think the same, right? None of those are politically palatable or achievable in any practical sense. So really, if you're interested in getting special interests out of policy making and saying special interests are a real problem in how laws are made, then limit the ability of government to respond. Putting a lid on the honeypot, if you will take away the ants. So saying that government can only act in these few very clearly delineated instances. Government can only pass laws that achieve these very few delineated ends, in making it clear what government can and cannot do, and taking away the ability for a politician who has a very strong incentive to respond when an interest group comes to their office and says, hey, we have both money and clout within your district, you ought to do something for us. I think it would be much easier to make it impossible for that politician to actually do something than it would to say that group can no longer speak to that politician. So I think in terms of removing special interests from the process, that's probably the best way to go about doing it. And I think the leeriness, for lack of a better term, the fear people have of big business getting into government isn't specifically reserved for any one ideology. I think left, right, across the political spectrum, people get very nervous when business and government come together to achieve something. And typically what you see is people on the right will attack government, and people on the left will attack the private actors, the businesses, and the individuals. But I think they're both attacking the same problem, and that is that the government is in a position to do things that discriminate against some people and privilege others. I think once you take that away, the problem more or less solves itself. If you were to institutionalize, let's say, a generality principle and say that government may not take any coercive acts that benefit some and not others, or that discriminates against some versus others, government cannot do those things. I think you make it much more difficult for both, let's say, the consumers and the producers of bad policy to continue to produce bad policy.
Thanks. Yeah, that's interesting. How similar it is to the question about the greater good, right? If you don't have, if you don't talk about the specific mechanisms you're using, it's kind of silly to talk about doing this or doing that, because we're not really sure what's actually going to happen.
Yeah, and
whereas if we talk about sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, and I think all these ideas are really connected. The idea of limited government, spontaneous order, protection of the individual, rule of law, all of these are all intertwined with one another. And really it all comes down to fundamentally a principle of generality in governing. That is, that government can only take general action in these few clearly delineated instances. Government can't say we're taking money from this person and funding this project for this other person's business, or we are going to prohibit you from engaging in this activity, but letting this other person continue to act in that way. And I think when you take out it's a protection for the individual. It requires the rule of law. It allows for spontaneous order to arise, and ultimately it ensures durable protections and durable limits on government.
So I was going to ask if there was one thing you wanted people to walk away with from the course, what would it be? It sounds like this generality principle is maybe something that would be central, this idea that everything should be applied generally in governance. Is that what you would say is the most important fundamental idea here, or is there something else that you think is number one?
I think that's I think that so can I go with two things?
Sure.
Okay, so I would say the first thing would be that we should hold the protection of the individual as the central focus when it comes to how government acts. So the individual should always be the unit of observation, if you will, and everyone should always keep the protection of the individual at the front of the conversation when we talk about doing anything with regard to government. And then the second would be generality. But I think that builds off of the protection of the individual, is that we should strive as a norm, as a principle, as a clear institutional requirement that government not take any discriminatory acts that privilege some at the expense of others. In particular, that generality be the reigning principle in how laws are made.
Awesome. All right, so there you have it, folks. The most important things: generality and looking out for the individual. I think we don't have any questions from folks watching, but Professor Koopman, if there's anything that you wanted to add that we didn't get to talk about, that you really wanted to make sure we hit on, we can talk about that now. Is there anything that you wanted to go into?
I don't think so. I mean, I think this pretty much covers it. Most of the other stuff, I think, go see the videos. They cover these things. They're all about 5 minutes each. They're not that long. You can catch them in between the whatever episode you're binging on Netflix these days. And I think they're pretty informing and entertaining, but I'm a little biased. And I think that covers most of it. And if I can, leave the audience with one thing, feel free to reach out to me. If you have questions, if you're like, hey, I don't understand what you said here, or hey, I disagree with you, feel free to come find me on Twitter or come email me directly. I'm more than happy to continue the conversation, not just here, but into the future.
And can folks find your email address on the Mercatus page?
They can. It's C Koopman, so CKOOPMAN at mercatus.gmu.edu. And my Twitter handle is the same as my email address. It's just C Koopman. So come find me in either of those places, and I'm more than happy to continue the conversation in any direction that you all would like to take it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for doing this interview. Thank you so much for hosting the course. And then for making yourself so available for questions, follow-ups, debates, all of that. I think anyone who's checked out the course so far knows that it's a very interesting, very informative look at really basic ideas about libertarianism, about the philosophy of liberty. If you've watched the other sections so far, go watch the law section. If you haven't watched any of them yet, as a reminder, you can sign up right next to the screen. Sorry, let me make myself. You can sign up right next to the screen if you're watching from the email link. If not, you can sign up through the SFL website or the Learn Liberty website. And as a reminder, if you sign up within the next hour, we'll send you a $15 discount code for the International Students for Liberty Conference. That's going on here in DC, February 26th through 28th. And it'll be a great time to discuss ideas like this with over 2,000 libertarians. So we're really looking forward to that. And then I wanted to also thank Liberty.me for hosting SFL Live these past couple of months. It's been really cool. And I would encourage everyone to go check out other Liberty.me shows as well. One in particular that's coming up soon. So actually this Sunday, January 10th at 8 p.m., there's going to be a Liberty Classics show on music and politics. And it looks like it's going to be with Jeffrey Tucker. It's going to feature Justin Bieber songs. That looks like a very interesting one. So if you liked this, haven't ever done a Liberty.me show before, check that out. And of course, look out for more SFL Live shows in the future. Thanks, everyone.